Okay, welcome. We're just getting kicked off here with the Midwest cohort, our remote group technical assistance for the day. And we have done these now a couple of times in different regions, so we're really excited to be here in the Midwest. We've got you for a couple of hours from 11 to 1 here in Central Time. But it doesn't have to go that long. It really just depends on the conversation and how much there is to talk about. This is really intended to be interactive, and so I'm hoping that you all can help with the discussion. I'm Angie Hacker. You guys know me from the national webinar trainings that we're facilitating through the Paul Abandoned Mission Indians. I'm typically located in California, so the Midwest is not my natural forte, although I've done some work and some conferences and things that have been in the Midwest. But I am aware of some of the resources and tools and things that you all are dealing with, but I'm hoping this is more of a discussion so you guys can chime in and tell me what really there is to know. With that, so this is what we're going to do today. And after this slide, everybody will get a chance to introduce themselves and just saying hello to the new people that have arrived. If you wouldn't mind putting yourself, getting your audio set up. And if you can, if you're comfortable and if you're in a good place for it, if you could put your webcam on if you have one. This is a more intimate group and it really helps to be able to see each other during these smaller discussions. And then, just in the interest, if you have any background noise going on, just go ahead and mute yourself temporarily. Okay, so the agenda for today is basically we'll do introductions. I want to hear from each of you a little bit about yourselves and what you're working on. I have a list of regional resources that I'm aware of in the Midwest area that I'd like to share with you, and that should be a dialogue also. You can tell me what I'm missing, and really if you want to give me some context about how useful those are or if there's particular items that resource is really good at providing. And then we'll have some time for some facilitated discussion to share regional knowledge, experiences, ideas, and needs. Part of the goal of today, hi Michelle, is to really have a conversation about what's regionally important, but also to build some networking opportunities in as well. We'll also have time towards the end for the demonstration of the tribal climate health and adaptation tools. So some of the things we'll touch on briefly during the national webinar series, but this gives us a chance to maybe dive in a little bit more deeply on some tools that we have built under the Tribal Climate Health Project that are attempting to accelerate the process or make it a little easier for you to do your adaptation work. And I'll show you what those are. And then at the end, there's additional Q&A. If we have time, we'll do that as well. So I'm going to be tracking too what I hear from folks on the call in terms of extra resources that you found helpful, and I'll add those to the slides. The slides will be available afterwards. The recording will be available afterwards as well and can be distributed to whoever you'd like. All right. So there's actually 9 members of your cohort that signed up in the very beginning when you all signed up for the training. 9 people that said, yeah, I'm in the Midwest and I want to be part of a cohort. And I think it represents about 3 tribes from what I can tell. And yeah, we'll see who comes on today, but hopefully we'll reach others with the recording. But when we looked at the folks that participated in the training, really this region is made up from folks from Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, and Missouri. So really quick, just before we have you all introduce yourselves, the purpose again is to provide technical assistant remote workshops that are designed for and focused exclusively on unique climate and health exposures, impacts, and strategies of selected regional cohorts. So this is something we promised to do. This is funded by a BIA Tribal Resilience Grant, and so we just wanted to provide a small opportunity to dive deeper than we're able to do on the national webinar series on issues that are pertinent to your region. And so it's supposed to supplement the national training and give an opportunity for regional sharing and also to support regional and multidisciplinary relationship building and collaboration. So I think today, hopefully we'll have folks from tribal agencies, we have FEMA, we have Wisconsin Sea Grant, so interorganizational collaboration could be really useful here. So now it's time for you to introduce yourself, if you wouldn't mind. If you'd give us your name, your organization, where you're located, either normally if you're in the office or at home where you happen to be today, or both. And then tell us a little bit about your role in climate change. And don't forget to unmute yourself. Who'd like to go first?
Sure, I can go first. Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Chin. I'm the Climate and Tourism Outreach Specialist for Wisconsin Sea Grant. I also run our Lake Superior field office, which is in Superior, Wisconsin. So up in northern Wisconsin on Lake Superior. So I'm pretty new in my role. I started about 9 months ago, but some of the big projects that I'm working on right now related to climate change. One is that I'm leading a tourism and outdoor recreation working group for the Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, or WICI. And this is a statewide effort to assess how climate change is going to impact different sectors in the state. And so I have a working group with members across the state, including tribal representatives. I'm also working on a flood resilience scorecard, which is meant to help communities build their resilience to flooding. And we're looking to pilot test that in northern Wisconsin, where they've been dealing with a lot of extreme flooding over the last decade. And, you know, otherwise work kind of across the state and regionally, some national work as well. But those are the big things that I'm working on right now related to climate.
Great. You know, we're actually going to try to use the chat box here a lot too, that if you have resources or links that you want to share to stuff your organization's working on or things that tribes could benefit from, yeah, just go ahead and add it to the chat box, and I'll be adding those resources to the end of the slide deck before it's distributed. Thank you, Natalie. Who'd like to go next? Maybe Nicholas?
I can go next, sure. My name is Nicholas, go by Nick. I am at FEMA Region 5 in Chicago. I am in the mitigation division. I function as the mitigation tribal liaison, predominantly working on developing flood risk products, strengthening relationships, and kind of disseminating information and building capacity on the program we offer. My role in climate change, there's a very exciting and dynamic product that FEMA has been, FEMA's offered for several years, but it's kind of growing. It is called Changes Since Last Firm. It is a way of looking at how floodplains have changed over time, at least since the last time a flood map was made. So there's an expansion of that program. So we are trying to find different ways to incorporate that in local planning and wild rice harvesting and ecosystem restoration work. It's a product that we've seen a lot of our rights holders in the region request, and there's a lot of interest and expansion. So we're hoping that that can be a very dynamic climate change tool moving forward.
Yeah, if you have a link for that as well, that would be great to drop in the chat box. So we have some good agency experts with us today. Really appreciate it. And Nicholas was telling me he's also on covert efforts, so he's making some time for this, which is really wonderful for us. Thank you. Michelle, are you able to introduce yourself?
I am sorry, I am on my phone, so I am not really stable, but it's the only way you can hear me. So yeah, I'm Michelle. I'm in Minneapolis, and I am a volunteer with Minnesota 350, which is kind of, if you've heard of 350.org, we're kind of the state version of that. And I'm a part of our pipeline resistance team, and so we partner with a lot of our native populations in northern Minnesota and also right here in Minneapolis to fight our pipeline. I am also partnering with a number of people in northern Minnesota are Anishinaabe population to do rights of nature for the Mississippi River. So trying to get legal personhood, I guess, if you will, or just legal rights for the Mississippi. So that's the group that I'm facilitating. And I guess I just really wanted to find out what else is going on in the Midwest that I can help support and be a part of. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you so much, Michelle, for being here. And again, sounds like you have some good links you might be able to drop in the chat box as well. So thanks. I also see we have Allison Rakowski.
Hey, I go by Allie. I work for Redcliffe as the water resources project manager. So essentially, I'm in charge of coordinating our stream water quality research. We basically just take a bunch of water quality samples on the reservation and then just kind of keep track of what's going on in those streams. And we also have recently, as our TNR, our Treaty of Natural Resources Department, are in the process of writing a comprehensive plan, which basically will help guide the next 10 years of management, so to speak. So a big part of that was also adding in climate change adaptation as well.
Oh, great. So is your role part of an environmental department at Redcliffe?
It is, yep, which is under the Natural Resources Division.
Natural Resources Division, great. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. It's glad to hear you guys are working on adaptation there. And I also see a caller one. That might be you, Michelle. I can't really tell, or maybe it's somebody else. Is there anybody
that could be
else?
me. My name's Noah. I also work for Redcliffe. I'm the environmental justice specialist and predominantly focus on the extraction industry and the projects that they have across ceded territory. And I'm also involved with some of those lower level adaptation mitigation planning efforts.
Great. So Noah and Allie, you guys work together?
Yep, Allie's my boss.
Okay.
That is not true. I'm not his boss. We're just office mates.
Horizontal organizational structure. Okay, well, thank you all for being here. I think we have a good crowd. Allie and Noah, if you're comfortable, we're asking people to put themselves on webcam just so we can see each other. If you're able, if you have the webcam availability, it's not required. It's just a small group and it helps for us to chat. I also want to apologize in advance. I'm really pregnant right now, and so I'm out of breath, but don't worry, it's not the virus, it's just I'm big. All right, so what I want to start here with is just a little bit of an introduction to Midwest climate exposures and impacts. And really, to be honest, you all are the ones that know the most about this, but here's what I'm gleaning from some of the national literature that does focus down onto regions. And so I just want to present it and then open it up for discussion. You can fill in some gaps, and then we'll talk a little bit about how these exposures are tied into health impacts that your community may already be facing. As you see on the right there, that's our typical framework for the drivers of climate change. This is what we've been using in the Tribal Climate and Health Adaptation series. And so, same as usual, those primary exposures are what we've been talking about. In the Midwest, it really seems like the ones that are key for you all are temperature extremes, storms and flooding, and as it relates to the Great Lakes, sea level rise, but more melting ice. I do hear also about drought, but perhaps to a lesser extent than what we're used to here in the Southwest. And I think you might receive some negative impacts from smoke from surrounding areas, but wildfires may also not be quite as devastating as they are in the West. But why don't you all tell me a little bit more about that? But generally from the National Climate Assessment and Climate Health Assessments at the national level, we're hearing that extreme heat heavy downpours, and flooding will affect infrastructure health, agriculture, forestry, transportation, habitat conditions, air and water quality, and more. I'm very aware that the region is really well known for its agricultural production, and so there's some mixed reviews about what's going to happen to the agricultural production, just in terms of the data showing us that there might be an increase, temporary increase in crop yields just because of the warming temperatures, but those impacts being negated by some of the more adverse effects to agriculture, like scouring of croplands and things like that. We also know that your region is very well known for containing large areas of federal and state and private forests and preserves, which have a big ecological service for the entire nation, and so those are also being threatened as well. So what I'm reading is that there are increases in humidity and precipitation that are eroding soils, creating favorable conditions for pests and pathogens, degrading the quality of stored grain. And so basically some of the warnings are that without some major technological and cultural advances, projected changes to the will reduce Midwest agricultural productivity to levels of the 1980s, which I imagine is much less than today, 40 years ago. And then specific to the Great Lakes area, climate change is basically expected to exacerbate some of the risks that are already there, including the range and distribution of certain fish species, increased invasive species, harmful blooms of algae, and declining beach health. Ice cover declines will lengthen the commercial navigation season. So those are coming, like I said, from some of those national reports. And so I think we talked a little bit about the primary exposures that might be key for you. All 4 of these secondary exposures sound like they're going to apply to your region. The worsened air quality, some of that having to do with even indoor mold as a result of the flooding that I hear very intense there. Vector changes, primarily we're hearing West Nile and Lyme for your region. Water insecurity, both in the form of contamination, a lot of it related to the flooding, and recreational usage, and then food insecurity to the extent that communities are reliant upon your local agriculture and fishing industries. So I want to hear from you what health impacts your community is already facing. Anybody willing to chime in? And I would love to hear actually from Red Cliff folks if you're around and able to unmute yourself.
I can talk a little bit in terms of some of the water, but Noah knows a little bit more about the food since he also works with our farm. So temperature is definitely going to be a big thing. We have a lot of cold water streams that hold native brook trout, which has been a really important species for the tribe. Flooding is another big issue. And with that comes additional turbidity, which is one of the biggest problems in terms of water quality that our streams are having right now, just because of the increased erosion and flooding and just the sheer number or amount of water that's running through our streams during these extreme precipitation events. Ice cover will be another thing, which in theory could either, well, predicted to decrease the water levels on Lake Superior, but our tribal fishery is also another really important resource. So just the amount of flooding and also the fluctuation in lake levels have been big influence on our commercial fishery.
So you're seeing economic impacts, which of course tie in with health impacts. Are you already seeing any kind of food scarcity issue?
I don't think that we're seeing any sort of change in food scarcity. But being in a rural community, I mean, there's not a lot of access to like commercially produced and distributed food. There's like a small grocery store on res, but otherwise people have to leave town. And I mean, as far as like access to like traditional foods, it depends on who you're talking to and, you know, how they remember things from they were younger. But there definitely have been significant shifts in access to like specifically relatives that were trapped or larger fur bearers that were harvested that have since started to leave this area as things change around them. I'm thinking about like moose or elk. So yeah, but as far as health impacts, I wouldn't say that we've necessarily seen any sort of increase in health concerns. But I mean, it is a population that has higher rates of asthma and other respiratory concerns, diabetes, etc. And so as the environment continues to change, or whenever we periodically get those wafts of smoke from the fires out west, that becomes an immediate concern, as well as the potential role that mold might have after some of those flood events.
Yes. Thank you. I'm also hearing, you know, in some of the literature that tribes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota contain ceded territory that are used for hunting, fishing, and gathering native plants that play a big role in cultural and spiritual health and cultural heritage, and that projections for the climate and the ecosystem changes are going to have strong impacts on these activities. And so just curious too if y'all are seeing any changes to cultural practices that are affecting folks. And I don't know, Michelle, if Michelle's on, oh, was that you, Natalie? Maybe if Michelle's on too, I'd like to hear what you hear from the tribes that your organization works with as well.
Well, I would say as far as, I don't know exactly, this is a part of the climate change chain, but what's going on with Line 3 in northern Minnesota is really having an impact on the tribes up there because they're already doing pre-construction of the pipeline, even though it hasn't been approved. And so the fact that they're doing that and cutting down a lot of trees and everything has been scaring away all of the traditional food sources with the animals. And so all the food that they have come to rely on is not there anymore. So their hunting rights have been, you know, taken away, and they really have lost all of their food sources. And we have had with MN 350, the organization that I'm a part of, and just a lot of people down here, we have been collecting food from people and then running food up to northern Minnesota. And that's what we've had to do for the last year now, so that people are able to have food. So it's been pretty dire, especially on the Fond du Lac Nation, as far as people not having access to food.
And so folks, it sounds like in the Midwest might be more reliant upon tribes, reliant upon their local agriculture and harvesting and fishing practices than maybe some tribes, you know, a lot of tribes in the Southern California area are sort of more reliant upon a global food market, which could be impacted as well, but maybe less immediately.
Something that, oh,
yep.
Yeah, I have a few things that just came to mind. One thing that came up in a meeting that I had with folks a few days ago was, you know, because of fluctuating a lot of water levels, high water levels, maybe needing to rethink where Menominee is being planted, wild rice is being planted, and maybe needing to do some more strategizing in terms of where those wild rice beds are going. The other thing is that there's a couple members of Fond du Lac who have been holding mental health support groups for the community related to solastalgia, you know, issues of anxiety and depression, et cetera, related to changing climate. And so there have been a few of those that have happened this past year, of course, with coronavirus. makes things a little bit more difficult. The other thing is harmful algal blooms. Those have been occurring more in Lake Superior when they didn't really have any record of those happening before. So kind of related to beach closures and access to outdoor resources, that might be something that becomes more of an issue in the future. And also related to water levels and a lot of coastal erosion, thinking about beach closures and losing beach access and public access. I know that, and this is more of a question for Allie and Noah, but they run, Red Cliff has Frog Bay, which is the first tribal-owned national park in the United States. And I'm curious if they, maybe with flooding or infrastructure, if that park has been damaged or at all or impacted by kind of climate patterns or weather in recent years.
I haven't heard too much other than, like relatively routine trail maintenance, as trees fall down after storms. In general, Red Cliff hasn't been as hard hit by flooding in this region. Looking at like the 2012, 2016, the 2018 floods. I think part of that is elevation. I'm not sure, maybe Allie has more insight on that though. As far as like the coastal component of Frog Bay, I know that, there's like very little beach currently, and I'm not sure how that's expected to change with the amount of snow we got this winter, considering the lack of ice cover on the lake.
What also helps with Frog Bay is that it's a coastal wetland, so it's kind of used to seeing fluctuations and changes in water levels, and so that kind of buffers a little bit against some of the damage that we could maybe otherwise see.
So folks, Nicholas had to step out for a moment, but he'll be back, which is great because I would love to hear a FEMA perspective on what he hears from tribes in terms of disasters and emergencies and response. Sounds like he works quite a bit on flooding. Also, Michelle, you had asked a question about how you see a presentation on your phone. I think with the app, if you scroll, you might be able to get to a screen that shows the screen share. That's my only advice if you try scrolling and trying to find the audience view. Okay, well, thank you so much. That's a good conversation. This is some of what I'm gleaning from the literature, and you guys filled in some additional information about some of the health impacts. So basically we hear increased heat wave intensity and frequency, increased humidity, degraded air quality, reduced water quality will increase public health risks. So those health risks include drinking water and fish contamination, so ingesting possibly contaminated water and food, flood-related injuries and death, and that could also relate to folks being trapped. And so it'd be interesting to hear. That's very true, even in Southern California here for tribes, that that's one of the primary concerns is that people get trapped, partially because their transportation infrastructure might not have as many escape routes as maybe other communities, or might be older in need of repair. And so, part of what they're doing, some of the communities I'm working with are doing transportation resilience plans and things like that to try to mitigate some of the flood risks. Also heat-related illness and premature death. On the right there, you can see actually premature death projections for your area by 2050 and 2090. This one's related to ozone. Ozone is an air pollutant that is irritating to the respiratory system and is correlated with higher temperatures. And so you can see in your area, if you see that you're at a higher risk area for premature deaths. We also mentioned mold exposure, which can cause respiratory issues as well. Mental stress, I'm so glad, Natalie, you brought that up as well. Long-term impacts of stress after things like flood disasters, and even more gradual mental stress from things like drought, just in terms of anxiety, economic anxiety, concern about the natural environment and losses and change over time. And then the vector-borne diseases, so West Nile virus and Lyme. Down below that chart you see there is just talking, it's one chart from Chicago and just projections about days over 100 degrees in Chicago, and the projections for that you can see getting pretty extreme by the end of the century, especially for the higher emissions scenario. Okay, so I'm going to roll through some regional resources that I'm aware of, and then I'd be happy for folks to chime in on any of these to say, yeah, we really use that, or did you know about this other one, or whatever. And then we'll have a whole conversation about resources afterwards. So some of this, like I keep talking about the national literature, this does dive into some regional impacts. A lot of that I'm getting from the U.S. Global Change Research Project that produces the National Climate Assessment. So the 4th National Climate Assessment came out in 2018, and there are chapters for each region. So there is a Midwest chapter that I would point you to, a really good resource for an overview of some of the key impacts, risks, and adaptations that are starting to occur in the Midwest. There's also a link there for highlights, which I would think of if I'm in an organization and I want talking points, quick talking points that I can bring to decision makers about what's going on. You might look at highlights. All these reports are good content that I think were intended for you to borrow in the development of vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans. So I certainly steal from these documents all the time when I do those types of reports. There's also a tribes and indigenous people chapter in that report that I point your attention to as well. It's not a regional focus, but it does focus on tribal issues. And then there's also another report from the USDA, Climate Change and Indigenous Peoples, a synthesis of current impacts and experiences. And it's just a report that I like. It does provide case studies that would be applicable to your region, although the whole document is not applicable to the Midwest, but is relevant for Indigenous communities. I'm wondering if you guys are already aware of and working with your Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. And so this is so throughout the country, there are climate adaptation science centers, and they usually are staffed with with really good people, usually through a university, and also affiliate with some sort of tribal organization to bring information to tribes, typically through a tribal liaison. And so the Climate Adaptation Science Center generally works with natural and cultural resource managers in both the Northeast and the Midwest. So you're an interesting region because they've combined both Northeast and Midwest into the same Climate Adaptation Science Center. But they're supposed to help apply future climate scenarios to decision making and co-produce information and tools for climate change adaptation. So it's a good place to go for data and information. You could potentially contact these folks and see if there's any way to get some assistance for your tribe. If it were me, I'd be starting probably with a tribal liaison. So that's who we'll talk about next. Sarah Smith, and I'm pretty sure this is updated information, but you all can tell me.
Yep, it is.
Does somebody have something to say? Okay.
I was just confirming that is that's up to date.
Oh, great. So Noah?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So are you guys working with these guys already?
To some degree, yes. Sarah also worked with Glyphwick and other agencies to put together a tribal adaptation menu, which is like similar to, I think it's NIAX's adaptation menu, or like the Forest Service's adaptation planning stuff, but specifically geared towards tribes and incorporating Anishinaabe and Menominee perspectives.
Yes. Yeah, that's actually I think my next slide. But anyways, there's a link here. There's her contact information. You know, I should have invited her to participate on this call actually, but in my experience, these folks are really good to work with. They're sitting there sort of waiting to work with tribes, trying to figure out how to help. At the very least can point you to more information and where to get it, could potentially help you analyze some of the information data that you might have access to, and can point you in the direction of how to, you know, steps to take on your adaptation work. So yes, so this is GLISA. This is a NOAA-RISA team, so basically one of the regional integrated science and assessments teams across the country. So this is for the Great Lakes area. So one of the cool things that this organization has is it synthesizes local climate information for partners throughout the region. This is its webpage where it actually provides climate divisions for the Great Lakes area. So it's cut up your region into pieces that you can actually click on and have some high-level data already pre-calculated for you, things like precipitation and temperatures and things like that. So this is one place to go for data. And then actually somebody on our cohort, the Midwest cohort here, is from the College of Menominee Nation. And I wish they were on, but they seem like a great resource in the area. I think they are also part of the, I think they're part of the consortium that makes up the Climate Science Adaptation Center in the area, but they have a Sustainable Development Institute. And on the right there, you see what they developed as an indigenous-based theoretical model of sustainability. So that's how they sort of think about, categorize, I think sustainability as well as climate impacts and ways to adapt. There's also they also have a Center for First America's Forest Land, and it looks like they have a great partnership with the USDA Forest Service to work with tribal stakeholders and support sustainable forestry management. Are folks familiar? I mean, are folks working closely with this institution? Just curious. As Noah mentioned, this is the Tribal Climate Adaptation menu. This was only released, I believe, in the last year. I've participated in some webinars learning more about it. I think this is a very thoughtful document that was developed by folks, tribal folks, and folks from tribal organizations in the Midwest. And so it's a tool to assist in developing specific adaptation actions that recognize and incorporate tribal perspectives. And I really like it because it gives higher level and more detailed level ideas for the kinds of adaptation actions tribes might consider. And a lot of it's relationship based. It's more relationship based than some of the other documents that might have a more Western feel that are talking about adaptation strategies as in like infrastructure improvements and more hardscape things. These are, you know, how do you actually collaborate in a tribal community to do some of this work. There's also a Midwest Climate Hub. So the USDA has regional climate hubs across the country. And so the Midwest has one of these. And it looks like their goal is to provide information that will help producers. So it's more agriculture related. Producers cope with climate change through linkages of research, education, and extension partnerships. And so it would incorporate, I think, all the states where folks on the call are from. And I don't know, I actually have no idea. Maybe folks can kind of talk a little bit about whether or not this is an organization that you've ever thought to go to for information, or if they've reached out to you. Maybe Michelle or Noah or Allie. And it's okay if not, this is just one more thing to put in your back pocket. I did mention this on the national webinar series too. There are tribal epidemiology centers across the country. So there are 12 of them, and there are a couple that might apply to folks in the Midwest region. So you see I have a link there to the Great Lakes Tribal Epidemiology Center. There are also others in the Great Plains and Northeast that could come in handy, or actually United South and Eastern Tribes is what they call this big area on the eastern side. And tribal epidemiology centers are great. They are thinking about climate change already. They're trying to figure out what kinds of health-related information tribes will need to support their adaptation efforts. And so their job is to help tribal communities in their efforts to improve health by building capacity to collect and use data. One of the projects that my team is also working on with Paula in Southern California is working with the Tribal Epidemiology Center there to come up with a standardized list of indicators that that tribal epidemiology centers can use to extract data. So basically making it clearer and easier for them to fulfill data requests from tribes by figuring out what meaningful data tribes really need on health. And so sort of getting some economies of scale around capturing data for tribes around health and climate. And then I wanted to just point out a couple of state-specific resources. In Minnesota, Minnesota seems to have a pretty good and active climate and health program. And so there's a climate and health webpage I'd point you to. There's just a snapshot of what you see on your screen. They're providing some basic information that, again, is something you could pull from for your reports. And there's also a climate and health profile report that was built for the state in 2015. Another good probably reference material. And then they even have an extreme heat toolkit. And I've seen this in a lot of conferences and webinars, and Minnesota seems to get some good credit for their work here. And so they have tips and fact sheets and data, and there's even a heat vulnerability tool. And so if you're in Minnesota, this could be a great place to go if you're particularly interested in extreme heat. And then in Wisconsin, they've also got an active public health department. They have a climate and health page. They also have climate and health toolkits, which would support things like a community engagement toolkit, some information on heat, flood, winter weather, wildfire. So one more place to go. And what I've also found to be really helpful here in California is to build a relationship with the folks that are doing this work in those state agencies. So I'm pretty close now with the folks at California Department of Public Health in the Climate and Equity division that they have. And I talk, we ask them questions all the time, and they're really responsive. There's also a Wisconsin Initiative on Climate Change Impacts, and they had developed a report, Wisconsin's Changing Climate Impacts and Adaptation, and that was from 2011. So another reference material. So for folks on the line, are there other state resources and reports that you would want added to this list? And I'm curious in general too, just about your relationship with these state agencies and whether or not you're working together.
I can't really think of any additional state resources. We work with the state a little bit, but the thing is that we are located in Bayfield, which is the very tippy top of Wisconsin, and our closest state office is about 45 minutes away in Ashland. And so we do work with them a little bit. I guess different divisions work more so with the state. Like our fisheries department works very closely with the state because they help state set quotas for Lake Superior. But water resources, not super close to the state, but we do work with them on occasion.
And where would you guys go for health partners in your region?
No, I'll let you take that one, but we also have in a separate department, I guess some type of health coordinator. So I don't know a ton about what he does or where he gets his resources, but that's kind of a separate department for us.
Okay.
Yeah, so we've got a IHS facility on res, a community health clinic, and there's an environmental health specialist there. So I'm not sure who he would work with. I would assume it'd be a combination of county health department, the state health department, and then the tribal epidemiology whatever facility, I want to say, is based out of Lac de Flambeau over here. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was in contact with them. That's about maybe 3 hours from Red Cliff.
Okay.
I know that, you know, something I've run into with dealing with the Department of Transportation for road maintenance and specifically culverts is that they're not able to upsize culverts because of internal policies. And so that's been something that we've run into time and time again when we're brought in for consultation for road maintenance nearby and they're doing culvert replacement, but they're not willing to size them up.
Ah, I see. Okay, so that you're communicating a lot with transportation folks, but maybe not as productively as you'd like.
Yep, you know, it's the state.
Well, that's helpful. I probably should add transportation agencies to this list. And also, since we're still on the Wisconsin slide, I should probably include Wisconsin Sea Grant. And maybe, Natalie, do you want to give us a little more information about why tribes should contact you and what you could do specifically to support them?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we have a pretty big staff that works on different issues across the state. We had a couple. We have a summer educator cruise that a few tribal folks were on this past summer to help bring in TEK into kind of more into the classrooms for these educators that are from across Wisconsin and Minnesota. We do have some wild rice projects that a colleague is working on. Let's see what else. Yeah, I mean, we work on a lot of different issues.
Do you guys consider
and try
yourselves
to be good
sort of
partners.
like technical assistants for tribes, or do you provide grants? Do you support projects? What do you?
A mix of both. I mean,
Yeah.
we have a research, education, and outreach mission. So I think there are grant opportunities. There are also opportunities where we can provide technical assistance. We have coastal engineer on staff who can help do site visits and property evaluations. We also work closely with other agencies like Wisconsin Coastal Management Program, DNR, other state and federal agencies, and try to, you know, be someone who can bring a lot of different folks together on important issues. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I want to move us into.
Oh,
go ahead.
can I add a couple of things?
Yeah, please do.
So in Minnesota, we have our pollution control agency that the tribes meet a lot with. So I would add that as a resource, definitely. We also have our environmental quality board. And so that also is another resource. And in addition to those two things, at the local level, we have in the city of Minneapolis, our Community Environmental Advisory Commission. And while that in and of itself is not, unfortunately, Native-led, nor do we have any Native people on it, we have had our Native community come to us and ask for help, in particular on a development that's going to take place in their community. And so we have been trying to help with that particular piece. And what has happened as a result of that is that they have done a health impact study, and I would love to share that with the group as a resource, because that has, come up with the asthma and the, all the respiratory diseases that are a result of pollution. And what the city is trying to do is to put in something that will cause more pollution in that area. So anyway, just thinking about not only the state level, but what are some of the things at the local level as well.
Yep. Thank you. And actually, could you, some of the things that you mentioned, the reports and ways to contact those consortiums, could you add that to the chat box as a link? If you, I know you're on your phone, so it might not be easy right now, or you could email it to me later.
Yep, I will do that.
Okay. And I think you're totally right. We, if Shasta was here with the Paul Abandoned Mission Indians, she would tell you that she's got, I think, a uniquely good relationships that is formed with County Health Department in San Diego. And they've been really helpful, and they're super eager to support tribes. They're trying to figure out how, and they have lots of data that they can provide.
Just one quick thing to mention, Natalie and Michelle, you might already know about this, but Glyphwick and the people that did the tribal climate adaptation menu also hold workshops for that. So if you can actually get a big enough group together, and by big enough, I think they cap it at like 30 people, you can hold a workshop about the menu, which, it's one thing if you just go through and read it, it's kind of another if you sit through. I think it's a 2.5 to 3-day workshop. Noah's gone through it twice. I've done it once, and that's been really useful. I think Apostle Island National Lakeshore is going to be doing their own workshop, or having their own workshop for their staff, but that's always an option.
Can you,
Allie, have you?
Oh, go ahead, Allie.
Oh, I was going to ask also if Allie or Noah have worked with Kat Techman, who does the GWOW Climate Strong workshops at all.
Yeah, I have.
Is that another person?
Curious, or is there
I heard good things about it. I haven't had the opportunity to go through it, but a colleague at Sea Grant went through her workshop last summer, and she said it was really great.
Yeah, and for past summers at least, she's put together, like I think 5 or 6 different workshops for folks in higher ed, or K-12 teachers, or faculty in higher ed, and that's always a big component. So I'm sure there'd be, if there wasn't COVID going around right now, there'd be an opportunity for folks to wiggle their way into that workshop multiple times in the summer. Who knows this summer?
Yeah, I'll put a link to that in the chat.
Thank you. And I was going to ask on the tribal adaptation menu workshops happening. Can you tell us a little bit more about how those work and what people come away with at the end, and just for other folks in the Midwest that may want to participate in something like that? I think it was Allie that was mentioning it.
I'll let Noah take this one since he's done it twice, but I'll add a little bit. So we basically, for 2.5 days, just kind of slowly went through the menu, but I think, and had a bunch of different group discussions, and everybody, there were, I guess, 6 projects that different organizations came to the table with to basically kind of put their projects through the menu to kind of figure out how they might be able to use the menu for those specific things. And then they grouped people into those different projects. And so you got to, kind of do a hands-on approach to using the menu. But what was really important for me was just hearing the tribal perspective, because I've never worked for or with a tribe before, and I am not tribal either. So that was super important, and I walked away with a lot just going to that menu and just hearing kind of different perspectives, and yeah, just learning about different things that maybe I wouldn't have thought of, because I've grown up in a very Western education and culture.
Cool. Well, that's good to know. I didn't know that they were doing workshops like that, so that's good for me to share. So I have some prompts here for some discussion, trying to help us share regional knowledge, experiences, ideas, and needs. And what I think I'll do is I'll just kind of walk through these and allow anybody who would like to speak on anything that's applicable to them to just go ahead and do so. We'll kind of go round robin style. And so we're asking, what is your organization this should be done to prepare for health or other impacts of climate change? So you've told us probably a little bit about that. What health impacts are you most concerned about? Talked a little bit about that, but maybe just give us what's really risen to the top. What resources have been particularly useful? So say if you've already done a little bit of looking at your vulnerability, what resources where did you go for data? Who did you go to for help? What were some of your biggest challenges? What if you've already moved into adaptation strategies? And really, every community is adapting to some extent, even if they don't call it adaptation necessarily. Tribes for sure have been adapting for a very long time to a lot of different things. So what strategies are working? You know, if there were best practices you would say that you guys are seeing good results from, what would those be? What would you recommend those to other tribes? And then how have you partnered with other tribes or agencies in the region? And so anybody could go first, and if any of those questions aren't applicable to you, don't worry about it, but just wanting to hear more about your experiences. And if Shasta would hear, she'd bust out the goat, but I don't have the goat. Maybe Michelle, I know you're not working directly for a tribe, but you seem to work with tribes, and I wonder if you want to share some of this from your perspective.
Yeah, I guess I'm not really sure where to start with that, since I'm not really working directly and we don't have an adaptation strategy or anything.
Yeah. Well, how about when in your conversations, what's the top health concerns related to climate change in, for your organization and the stakeholders you work with?
Well, I know, like I was saying, with the neighborhoods that we have here in Minneapolis, that the respiratory diseases are the things that have risen to. So, the asthma is definitely one of the top ones. And so when you talk about having more cars, more pollution in the air, those are things that are definitely causing more alarm for people.
Yeah, so your focus is mainly on local pollution and emission sources associated with, it sounds like, the pipeline and transportation, less than maybe what we're talking about in terms of climate impacts. So things like, smoke, ozone, mold, those kinds of things.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Does your organization focus on trying to support adaptation strategies? Like for climate specific?
No. As far as like the flooding and those kinds of things?
Yeah, say flooding, any of the food or water insecurity issues, vector issues, the air quality concerns, flooding, temperature. So any of those exposures, creating impacts. Just wondering if you all are focused in any way on supporting strategies.
Right. Well, like the air quality, I've been talking about, we're trying to bring city council members. I mean, the main thing is we need to bring city council together with the community to try and figure out how to stop what's trying to go on with that. So, you know, a strategy is communication. But with the other organization that I'm with, MN350, I think I had mentioned earlier that we are and have been collecting food for people in the northern Native nations. So with food insecurity, that's one thing. Another thing is I was an instructor or a co-instructor for an environmental justice class in the fall. And we, for permaculture, we had designed a dream garden for somebody who has a camp up on the Fond du Lac Nation. He's a community healer. And so our dream, I guess we were going to be going back in the spring to fulfill his dream there. But that's kind of fallen a little bit by the wayside with COVID-19. But still, we've got a little bit of planning going on as far as building the garden there. So to help with some of the food insecurity that's going on. So I guess those are a few of the things that's going on.
Great, thank you. And I see that Nicholas has joined us again. So hello again, Nicholas. We just moved on to facilitated discussion, some prompts here for some types of questions that we're hoping to hear from folks on the line about your perspectives and experiences and ideas for your region. And I wondered if Noah, you might be willing to go next and answer any of these that are applicable for you.
Sure. I would say that to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a huge concerted effort to start to implement any sort of adaptation strategies at Red Cliff. But a lot of individual efforts do contribute to that larger unspoken goal or whatever. You know, we've been monitoring air quality for several years now. I think at least 5 or 6, with a long-term goal of getting treatment as a sovereign. And similar with what Allie was talking about earlier with water quality, so that, you know, we've got that quantifiable data when bringing up these concerns. The tribe, for a variety of reasons, is also heavily invested in making sure that the world around us is still healthy and well because of the dependency on access to treaty rights. And there's been talk in our fish hatchery about starting to consider what fish stocking will look like into the future. Again, because of these water level changes or water temperature changes, and this emphasis on food security and the role that harvesting fish, specifically for Red Cliff, has played traditionally. And then more garden-esque food security efforts have been going on as well.
And it sounds like you guys have begun a process of doing an adaptation plan. Is that right?
We sort of did a vulnerability assessment by doing a literature review of regional vulnerability assessments. Some years back, there was an adaptation plan developed that pretty much decided that they needed to go back and actually do a vulnerability assessment. And so rather than recreating the wheel, being that the majority of surrounding communities or intertribal agencies have done this work already, we kind of just reviewed that.
So are those documents public? I mean, are those things that you would share with other Midwest tribes?
The documents that were reviewed are all public, and when I go to my office next and I have that list, I'd be happy to share with you all. As far as the literature review itself, I don't see why it wouldn't be public, but I would need to check in internally to see if that's something that can be distributed.
Yeah, only if it's possible. But I think that sounds like something that could save some other tribes some time in reviewing the same literature. So that would be great if we can share that.
Could I ask a quick question of Noah and Allie? Is Red Cliff looking at all at renewable energy? Like, I know there's a lot going on in the region related to solar. I was just curious if the tribe is thinking about any of that at all.
Yeah, I've sort of gotten roped into that, and it's changed a lot from when I got roped, well, from when conversation started, I think 3 years ago to now. Right, we recently applied for one of the Department of Energy grants. At this point, I really should remember. I can't, though. I don't remember if it's like a $2 million project or 3 or what. I think we were looking at 600 megawatts, but yeah, I don't know. I've got a lot of feelings about the way the grant's going about, and don't really remember any details. But if that's a conversation you want to pursue, I'd be happy to refresh my memory.
Thanks. Just curious. Thanks.
There are a lot of tribes here in California that are taking microgrids really seriously at the moment, just in terms of energy resiliency. We'll be talking about that more on the national webinar series. So, microgrids often will tie in solar with storage and microgrid controls in order to provide more reliable energy for us in California in the case of power outages due to heat or de-energizations that are happening preemptively with wildfire concerns or during a wildfire. So we see a lot more power outages happening. Tribes are getting a little bit more proactive about ensuring their own sort of independence with their energy. Well, thank you,
Have
Noah.
you heard about tribes?
Go ahead.
Have you heard about tribes out west that are looking at solar, trying to find more environmentally friendly solar panels?
I know of lots of tribes going after solar projects, and what I'm planning to do is actually bring in my partner who does a lot of that work with tribes across California to talk to us about energy resilience when we get more to adaptation in the national webinar series. So he would probably be able to answer that question about different materials that are being considered for solar panels. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what you're hearing in terms of concerns?
Sure. And I mean, I haven't done any research into alternatives, so I don't know if they exist or don't exist, but just the reality that the minerals that are in solar panels, are still being mined out of the ground and contaminating water for somebody somewhere.
I see. Okay.
And so just trying to figure out how we can mitigate that while, everyone, or at least a lot of us, knowing that we need to move away from fossil fuels, and, especially with Michelle talking about Line 3 pumping 760,000 barrels of tar sands a day potentially, but not wanting to replace one evil with another.
I don't have information on that off the top of my head, but I think we can have that conversation probably let's do that on the webinar series. If maybe I can pull together some information by then, or my partner can. Okay, I actually wonder if Nicholas, we had just gone through all of the regional resources that I'm aware of, but I didn't have FEMA on my list, and I think I should. And I wondered if you could kind of talk a little bit more about why tribes could come to you for assistance, in what cases you work with tribes. Do you have, what access to resources, funding, or project support can your organization provide?
Yes, hello. Thank you for asking. Yes, so one, and for those at Red Cliff, I'm sure you're aware of mapping projects, floodplain mapping projects that FEMA is able to sponsor. There's no cost sharing. There's no application needed. It's one of those things where you just can email me or reach out to someone, maybe an engineer at FEMA, and begin talking about floodplain data. Floodplain data is multifaceted. It's owned, it can be owned by both agencies. Currently, the way that FEMA exists is we can't produce data and then give it to the tribe without the federal government owning a portion of it. So that's definitely a point of contention in a lot of cases. But that data is fantastic. It's versatile. It's able to be embedded and housed locally on servers. So that's one product that we can talk more about. And the way that the agency is conducting outreach for floodplain mapping on sovereign in and about sovereign nations is growing and changing, and we're finding different tools that can provide great products that aren't necessarily regulatory, that are less public, that can better honor sovereignty. So that's a positive new conversation. Then there is a ton of grants available. There is this new program called BRIC that I'm sure that some of you have heard about. It is a building resiliency and infrastructure grant that has yet to fully be rolled out, but is kind of a new program as the planning support grant is being sunset. And I would be happy to send you a list of what grants are available through FEMA and kind of write a little blurb about how they can relate to climate change and kind of general ecosystem resilience. And then we also have a series of workshops and trainings that I can also get a list, national trainings that function through the Emergency Management Institute, but then we're broadening our capabilities within the region to provide workshops and trainings that can span from ideas on how to mitigate the effects of flooding, to using data, to using FEMA's resources to identify flooding sources, and then also general planning support. So those are currently being developed and should be done by late July. And then we can talk specifically with different nations or different organizations to come out and do a meeting or a workshop. But we're always open to talking formally and informally about developing flood risk products. So I can write all of that down for you. I can give you all of these different worksheets that we have, fact sheets. We're also developing some things called recipe cards for tribal GIS technicians so that they can kind of have a literal step-by-step on how to use incorporate our data into a kind of a local map. And then we're also just happy to hear what the needs are and discuss different ways that we can change our products to better suit needs. In conversations we've had with Bad River, they've connected us to some other organizations that ways to share our Great Lakes coastal flood data, and also use our expansive network of floodplain data to help conservation on reserved land rights. So there's a lot of opportunities. Yeah, but I'd be.
I'm looking forward to yes, you writing a little bit of that up so folks know how to find it. And if you wouldn't mind, could you drop your email address or contact information into the chat box here?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Excellent. So yeah, so glad you're here to tell us about all of that. And yeah, the conversation around needs. I try to have this conversation a lot with the tribes I work with all over the country, and we're gonna be doing a lot more of that in California. Sometimes it's a hard conversation to just come at a tribe like, what do you need? And so structuring that conversation around like, all right, well, here's what we're aware of that's available to you. Is this useful? What's missing? Having the more nuanced conversation rather than just putting them on the spot like, what do you need? But if anybody on the line has ideas about other needs that organizations in the area could help with, let's go ahead and talk about it. Natalie, I don't know if you wanted to try to answer any of these questions if they're applicable for you.
Sure. Well, I mentioned kind of our involvement in the new Wisconsin initiative on climate change impacts. They're actually updating that 2011 report over the next year. So we're thinking about kind of recommendations for the governor's task force on climate change in the state, and how we might support adaptation and mitigation efforts a little bit better. I'm also part of a steering committee that's organizing a climate adaptation workshop in the Lake Superior area. Right now it's tentatively scheduled for February. We'll have to see how things are going around that time to see if we can still hold it. But that's a NOAA Digital Coast training focused specifically on climate adaptation for communities. So that's something that we'll be reaching out to participants in the region to participate in, sharing their stories about adaptation, what's working, what's not working, kind of these other questions about data and resources and what the needs are.
Can I ask one question? How do folks in the region communicate with each other? Is there already really good established networks to do that?
I mean, my feeling is that there is a pretty strong network. So I'm new to the region and my position, as I mentioned before. There's something called the Lake Superior Collaborative, which is a team of researchers and other folks from across kind of the northern Wisconsin area. There's also a new community of practice around coastal hazards for Lake Superior that's just starting up. That's being run by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. Might be Minnesota DNR actually, but there's a coastal management fellow that's working on that. I share an office with the National Estuarine Research Reserve for the St. Louis River, and they have a wide spanning network. But yeah, I mean, I feel like communication is pretty good up here. Other folks might have a different perspective, but that's kind of my feeling.
I know in the Northwest they have there's a Pacific Northwest Tribal Climate Change Network, and super active. And I just wondered if there was something sort of like that. That one's administered by a university, and so people are already communicating a lot. There's calls, and then there's a listserv, and I just wondered if there's something like that people could plug into if they haven't already.
Yeah, I don't know about specific for tribal groups, and others might know a little bit better, but I think that a lot of partners up here really value input from tribal members and try to involve them in kind of these larger other efforts, even if they aren't specifically tribal and health focused.
Yeah. I bet if we had our cohort member from the College of Menominee, they would probably tell us that they're working on that. I'm sorry, I sort of cut you off, so continue along.
No, that's fine. I mean, those are kinds of the big things that I'm working on. I mentioned the flood resilience scorecard that I'm working on with the Department of Health Services in Wisconsin. Yeah, I mean, there's a few things that are going on right now, but those are the highlights.
Yeah, maybe for Natalie, for you and for Nicholas, so from your perspective, trying to support communities, particularly on the flooding issue, what strategies do you guys really get behind? What approaches would you recommend to tribes to start preparing themselves for these impacts getting more intense and frequent?
I mean, I don't know if there's an easy answer to that. I know there's the Wisconsin Wetlands Association has a project going on in northern Wisconsin to look at kind of the role of wetlands in helping reduce flooding impacts. I think FEMA is doing some work. There's a coastal management programs project of special merit looking at culvert sizing and vulnerabilities related to culverts. Yeah, so there's a lot of work going on, but I don't know if I have
Yeah,
one
that's okay.
single like piece of advice for anyone. Yeah.
Maybe Nicholas, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I think you know, relying on historical knowledge and incorporating that with the data that's available. A lot of money is made available to produce flood risk data and coastal floodplain data, and it's not perfect, and sometimes it's hard to get, and sometimes it infringes on sovereignty, which is all important to acknowledge. But at the same time, it's a part of a story. It's a part of a narrative that is really helpful, and it can be a part of a plan. It can help identify evacuation routes. We've talked with GLFWIC, which is the Great Lakes. Maybe someone from Red Cliff can help me on this. It's the Great Lakes Fish and Wildlife. It's like it's a tribal organization.
Yeah, you're close. It's the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission.
There we go. Thank you so much. I always stumble on that. Where floodplain data, we've been in conversations with them, really, really high level, about using floodplain data and overlaying it with wild rice data and other conservation efforts. So, it's a lot is out there. It's a part of a huge network. It's easily accessible. So I think that is definitely a way to help elevate response and identify needs. And also, to be honest, it helps communities more generally by saying, hey, we don't have a flooding source there, but your data keeps showing it. And we're noticing that there is flooding here, but none of your maps have identified that. And being a part of a bigger story and developing a wider network, I think can definitely help resilience.
Thank you. And I see a caller 2 has arrived, but a caller 1 left. So that might be you, Noah, right?
Yep, I got disconnected.
Okay, great. All right, well, are there any other ideas, experiences, or needs that folks want to share before we move into the next portion of our meeting? Okay. Well, super appreciate that conversation. I learned some things about what's going on in the Midwest. I think we're fortunate to have everybody that's on the line. We're going to have more resources to share with you that will go out to the whole group afterwards. So thanks for that. Now we just want to turn our attention to a demonstration of the Tribal Climate Health Project's tools. And so this is what one of our key web pages looks like, but I'm actually just going to go right to the website and help you kind of navigate around it if you haven't been there already. So just as a little context, so the Tribal Climate Health Project is the program that sits behind the trainings that you're all involved in. And so that project was developed several years ago out of an initial EPA grant, and then has been fortunately continuously funded by other sources like the BIA Tribal Resilience Program. And so a lot of what we do is training, but we've also put together, the point of it is to do capacity building. And so while we do training as one of our hallmark features, as we were doing the research and the curriculum development, we realized that what we could really do to support tribes is to try to develop tools, templates, and other resources that could ease the burden of the work that it takes to get through this adaptation process as much as we could, with a complete acknowledgement that all tribal communities are different, unique, need to have customized approaches to all of this. and that a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work. However, there are some lifts that we can do to, we can just provide some information, some templates and other things to help. So I just want to navigate a little bit around the site. Most of the information that we produce is under the Learn tab. And so one of the things that we've produced is a resource clearinghouse. So if you are sort of newer to this topic, or you're looking for reference materials, or maybe you're looking for information on a specific subject, you could go to the resource clearinghouse, where there's a filterable list of about 500 resources, and we're trying to keep it updated. Anything associated with climate change and health that could be of interest to tribes. And so in some cases, there are tribal case studies, there are tribal examples of vulnerability assessments and adaptation plans, there are there's tribal literature and research, there's national documents, there's essays and publications, there's databases and websites, all sorts of things, and you can filter it by topic, type of material, type of resource, areas served. So for you all, you might click Midwest or Great Lakes and see what pops up for you. And so here are some things that are specific to the Midwest area. And further, if you want to look at resources by geography, you can look at our resource clearinghouse map, which is where we've taken those resources, tied it to a geographical location, and you can kind of scan in and look at anything that might be relevant, specific to your area. So I wanted to point that out, and feel free to peruse that at your leisure. And if you have anything you want to add to this resource clearinghouse that's not there, you can always send it to me, and under Connect, there's also a way to submit other resources that way as well. So I mainly want to point you also to the training materials page. This is where you can access training materials, presentation slides from previous trainings that we have conducted. Down here is a lot of our tools and templates. So one of the key tools that we have built is called the Exposures, Impacts, and Strategies Inventory. So the EASY tool. It's an Excel-based tool that is customizable, and it's intended to be a companion to these trainings that you're going through, and it's supposed to support the tribes that are going through conducting an adaptation planning process. And so really, it's an organized inventory of a lot of information and data sources that are trying to make it easier for you to make decisions associated with your adaptation plan. And so I'm actually just going to show you how it's super easy to download. Just click on it. Should pop down there, open it up. It's an Excel tool. There's a lot in here. So if you don't like Excel, it might scare you slightly. But we can also help you a bit if you're in here and you're getting lost and confused, but you recognize this framework. This is a little bit of instructions. This is still a beta tool because we're still refining it, but it has a lot of information in there. One of the first things we'd recommend doing is going to this exposure tab. So basically, as you're starting to think about doing your vulnerability assessment, the vulnerability assessment will be a way for you to look at the severity and likelihood of your climate exposures and your climate impacts. And so rather than starting from scratch and thinking, well, I don't know what are my potential exposures, we've taken the liberty of organizing the information from our own research and curriculum development here, so that you can easily, you can even sort by region. Here you can filter by region and just look generally at what the literature is saying about your top exposures. And so it's listed here, so you could look at drought, you could look at melting ice and sea level rise, severe storms and flooding, all the ones that we've been talking about. This column, you can also be filtering, if you'd like, by secondary exposures. And so even if all you did was the first thing you go in here and you filtered by your region, you could look at generally what the literature says is your main exposures and secondary exposures. And then it tells you what we were able to glean from the literature and best practices about indicators. So how would I, all right, so now I know a little bit about my exposures. How would I measure that? How are other people measuring that? And so there's a long menu of possible exposure indicators here that you could use. And the idea is you're just looking for different information so you can make a decision about your exposure risk level. And so it's pretty flexible. What it also does is if there is a good accessible data source that we recommend, we've linked it here. So for you all, you'd be looking at national data sources because we do a lot of work in California. There's actually a set of columns here for California, but you would ignore that. And then data findings. And so we would just be encouraging folks as you're looking at these data sources to populate in here like a worksheet what you're finding in terms of historical, baseline, and projected information. And this just kind of serves as a way for you to capture and compile your information and analyze it somewhat so that you can come up with a determination, say in this case for drought, what's your exposure risk level? And so we would just recommend high, medium, low, or none, and to go through that for all of the various exposures that are likely in your area. So that's the same thing. So that's exposures. We would recommend the same approach to impacts. And so what I like about this is that even if you didn't go and even look at the data that we're recommending to go seek, to go review data sources on a lot of these impact indicators, even if you were to just sort by the kinds of exposures you're really concerned about. So say, in the last tab, you decided certain ones were high risk and you want to look at those high risks and see what kind of exposures will come or what sort of impacts will come from them. You could just get this list that's populating from what we know from the literature and research that says these are likely risks. These are likely impacts for you. And if you want to look further, you could look at the impact indicators and the data sources. You could track your findings and you could rank an impact vulnerability level. So for example, if you find that temperature extremes, temperature increases are going to be a key concern for you, and you've ranked that maybe medium or high, there are health, health-related impacts, natural environment, and built environment-related impacts that you could filter by. Say, for example, heat-related stress, illness, and death is one possible impact. And here are a bunch of indicators and places to look for that data so that you could actually go and look what do our heat stress emergency department visits look like today. Problem with some of these data sets is that they're not as downscaled as we'd like them to be. They're not as boundary bound, so they're not going to be specific to maybe your lands or your reservation, but they get down to as location specific as is possible, and in some cases down to say county or census tract, and that's more useful than nothing. And then for whatever's not here, we're just suggesting this indicator. If you have a better access to data for any of it, please use it. So more local data, the better. And then similarly, we have a tab for population, for indicators that are associated with population sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So those are moderating factors that are community characteristics that will tell you whether or not your risk, your impact risk is going to go up or down just based on some community characteristics like your food environment index, your housing habitability, the ages of your population, the number of people that work outdoors or are insured, things like that. So another way to capture some of those pieces of data, those are important pieces when you're evaluating your impact risk. And so that's a way to track some of that information. And then finally, once you move to the adaptation planning phase, in your vulnerability assessment, you're prioritizing what are your most high interest vulnerabilities. So, all right, what's really coming at us? What's our risks? In your adaptation plan, you're attempting to come up with strategies and solutions to address those risks. Here is a list of over 130 adaptation strategy options that we've mined from literature best practices and the research. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's a place to get started so that you're not just brainstorming from scratch. You're not having to go into a bazillion different tribal adaptation plans, which you're still welcome to do and try to see what they're doing. You could filter by whether or not it addresses a certain exposure or impact type. You can filter by what kind of an adaptation strategy it is, whether or not it's policy or data information technology or community engagement, those kinds of things. And so basically what this tab is helping you do is to consider various adaptation strategies. You can edit the words here if you want to customize it for your own tribe. You can add more here at the end. You can filter, and then the idea is you would actually be able to do some planning. You'd be able to evaluate these strategies by some criteria that we've set up for you. If you'd like to use those, you can start thinking through some of the planning details, like, okay, we haven't done this yet. This is something that could really work here. We're going to plop it into years 1 through 3 because we think it's high priority. We're going to put this responsible department in charge of it, and some other details. Not too many details because nobody at the adaptation planning phase, most people don't have an opportunity to do like full feasibility analysis and cost benefit analysis, but you're doing some high level analysis, trying to catch any fatal flaws in terms of whether or not this is something that's really reasonable for you to do, plop it in somebody's plate in terms of responsibility and plop it in a period of time. And this is intended to be a dynamic kind of action plan. And this could support the backbone of your adaptation planning, which ends up being taken out of here and then put into an actual narrative report. But I just wanted to introduce this to you because I hope, at the very least, all the compiling of the strategies and the indicators and the data sources saves you time because you don't have to start from scratch. Are there any questions about that tool? I think, yeah, once you get into it and kind of use it, if you have questions, feel free to reach out. I also want to share with you, there's a survey template. And so it's something we call the Climate Vulnerability Experiences and Priorities Survey. This is what I use when I go into a tribal community. It's an online free, it's based in Google Forms. All you have to do is download it, create a copy for yourself, and you can customize it for yourself as much as you want for your own tribe, change the words, change the questions, but here's a place to start. A lot of tribes I work with don't necessarily have as much resources as they want to do, to conduct survey design or to do as much outreach as they want. However, we encourage as much as you can do to do, real community engagement. But if this survey template saves you time in developing questions that could be used in person or online, we would love for you to be able to get some value out of it. Talked a little bit about this on our last webinar, our national webinar series. But feel free to peruse through that and use whatever is useful. Did I just lose my page? I think I did. And just a couple more things I want to share with you. There's sample reports. So Paula was nice enough. I worked with Paula to develop their vulnerability assessment and climate change adaptation plan. So we posted downloadable documents that are both in Word, which is their reports, that if you want to download those and use them as a template and use the formatting, even use some of the content and references, feel free. They've been very generous about wanting to make that public, and so that could save you some time as well. And it helps you just to learn, there's a big art around developing those reports. You can organize them a lot of ways. This gives you an idea of one way to organize the information in these kinds of reports. And then there's a series of fact sheets we developed, again, for Paula around some exposures. And this, once you get into adaptation implementation, if you'd like to, this is just one way to look at community engagement and education. And then I think you heard on the last maybe national webinar series, this is the ITEP's Tribal Climate Change Resolution template. Another really good resource, another time-saving tool if you're looking to get buy-in upfront or when you're ready to adopt your vulnerability assessment or adaptation plan, this is a good resolution template. Okay, any questions about any of those resources? Okay. So we only have a few minutes left, really, and we've had a good conversation, but are there other technical assistance questions that you might have for me or for each other before we end the call today? Okay. Well, like I said, I'm going to take what you all have suggested in terms of resources, plug them into this last slide here. I really appreciate the interactive conversation. I'm so glad we got to chat in a small group. I feel like I got to know you all a little bit better. Any last comments before we close out for today? All right. We'll go ahead and close it out here. I hope you all stay really well amongst all the pandemic, and that you continue joining us through the national webinar series, and feel free to reach out to me at any point in time if I can be helpful. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.